Hello, and welcome to the 2020 Environmental Humanities Initiative Distinguished Lecture at Arizona State University. My name is Joni Adamson, and I am a President's Professor of Environmental Humanities and Director of the Environmental Humanities Initiative. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the 22 Native nations that have inhabited this land that we now call Arizona for centuries. Arizona State University's 4 campuses are located in the Salt River Valley on the ancestral territories of Indigenous people, including the Akimel O'odham and the Peepash Indian communities. We are grateful to live in this territory that is still home to Indigenous people whose care and keeping of these lands allows us to be here today. The Environmental Humanities Initiative acknowledges the sovereignty of these nations and advocates for the incorporation of Indigenous knowledges and research methodologies within contemporary sustainability practices and discourses. This afternoon, we are grateful to and offer warm thanks for our generous co-sponsors, the Institute for Humanities Research, the Julianne Wrigley Global Futures Laboratory, the American Indian Studies Department, the Global Institute of Sustainability, the Sweetie School for Sustainable Food Systems, and the School for the Future of Innovation in Society. This year's distinguished lecture supports and is run in association with a grant from the Mellon Foundation, which is funding the Environmental Humanities Initiative's collaboration with the University of Texas at Austin and the University of Pretoria in South Africa, along with 3 other universities around the world, all researching the complex issues of climate justice, concepts of scale, and the future of food sovereignty in arid regions. Our hope for this global partnership is that we'll be able to come to an understanding of the diverse array of factors, including place and geography, race, ethnicity, gender, age, ability, and economic position that influence the ways in which individuals and groups experience and react to the impacts of climate change, biodiversity loss, and the production of foods in increasingly arid conditions. This same array of factors enables or disenables food sovereignty, healthy nutrition or lack of nutrition that potentially increases risks of infection or vulnerability to COVID-19. It is for this reason, the urgency of all of this, that we are so honored to have Elizabeth Hoover with us this afternoon. We're actually thrilled to have Elizabeth Hoover with us this afternoon. As our 2020 Environmental Humanities Distinguished Lecturer, she joins a distinguished list of past EHI speakers, including Vanda Nashiva, Amitav Ghosh, Mary Evelyn Tucker, Paolo Bacigalupi, and Sir Jonathan Bate. She is nationally and internationally recognized and celebrated for her expertise in Native American food systems, food sovereignty, Native American environmental health movements, heirloom seeds, indigenous use of fire, community-based participatory research, environmental justice, and food justice. As a young girl, she planned to be a farmer, but she grew up to be an anthropologist who works with farmers and has traveled over 20,000 miles throughout North America, Canada, and Central America to interview farmers about their land and which they see as their relative. She's also interviewed them about culturally relevant foods and seeds and about how contaminants are endangering ways of life and life itself. Professor Hoover is an associate professor in the Environmental Science and Policy Management Department at the University of California, Berkeley. Her first book, The River is in Us, is an ethnographic exploration of Mohawk response to Superfund contamination and environmental health research. She also recently co-edited a book with Devon Mihesuah called Indigenous Food Sovereignty in the United States. We also want to add that we owe her an extra thanks for working with us after the postponement of the first lecture and through all of the rescheduling. And since that time, she's moved across the country to a new job and a new home on the West Coast. And so we're very, very thankful for her patience and for working with us through all of that. To make our conversation today more welcoming, we asked the audience to watch Professor Hoover's pre-recorded lecture in advance of this event. That lecture, titled From Garden Warriors to Gastro Diplomacy, farmers, chefs, and water protectors working towards food sovereignty, emerges from her current book project. Tonight's event will be interesting to you, whether you were able to watch the lecture in advance or not. But if you have not yet seen it, I invite you to go onto the IHR's YouTube channel, where you'll be able to view it at your convenience. Professor Hoover takes you on a whirlwind tour of the history of settler colonialism, its impacts on indigenous food systems, and she defines food sovereignty. She introduces important concepts such as the meaning and practice of rematriation of seeds and gastrodiplomacy. Now, let me briefly outline the order of our program today. First, I will turn the time over to Professor Hoover for about 25 minutes to reintroduce any of the issues she discussed in her lecture or introduce any new topics that she would like us to think about. Then we'll turn the time over to tonight's moderator, Melissa K. Nelson, who joined ASU as a professor of Indigenous Sustainability in August of 2020, and we're so lucky to have her. Professor Nelson is an Indigenous ecologist, writer, editor, media maker, and community-based scholar dedicated to Indigenous rights, sustainability, biocultural heritage, and environmental justice. She and Professor Hoover have been colleagues and friends for many years, working side by side in many places, so we could have no better moderator working with us this afternoon. After Professor Hoover and Nelson's approximately 20-minute conversation, Professor Nelson will open the discussion to a Q&A, and that's the point at which you can ask questions. You may have already noticed that the chat is disabled in Zoom, but you may ask questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, or you can write your question directly into the YouTube chat. Our moderators, Liz Grumbach of the IHR and McKenna Keller of the Food Sovereignty Research Group, will pass your questions along to Professor Nelson, who will present them to Elizabeth Hoover. I want to enthusiastically thank Liz Grumbach, McKenna, and Lauren Whitby of the IHR for helping facilitate this event. I also want to thank Joseph Carter of Live Streaming Success, who is running both our Zoom and YouTube sessions. We could not be here without the help and dedication of each one of these wonderful people. Finally, I want to thank Joan McGregor, the co-organizer of this event. Joan is Professor of Philosophy in Shippers and my co-PI on the Mellon Grant. She is in our audience, and I thank her deeply for all she has done to make this evening possible. I also want to thank every member of our Food Sovereignty Research Group who are also in the audience and who joined us with Elizabeth Hoover for a series of reading group events. Now, with that, I would like to welcome Professor Elizabeth Hoover, ASU's 2020 EHI Distinguished Lecturer. Elizabeth.
Thank you very much, Joni, and all of you who are joining us here today. So if you did not get the chance to see the talk in advance, I'm just going to kind of give a quick run through to give you a sense of what we covered so you can feel caught up. And essentially framing all of this talk and the work that I'm doing in the book that I'm currently working on is this desire for people in Native communities, Indigenous communities in the US, especially is where I focus, but more broadly as well, to move toward food sovereignty. So thinking about food sovereignty as the right of peoples to healthy, culturally appropriate food that is produced through ecologically sound and sustainable methods, and the right of people to define their own food systems. So it's not just, do you have equal access as everybody else in this settler colonial society to the same system, but your ability to define your own system. And Indigenous communities especially, these systems are built on social, cultural, and economic relationships that underlie community food sharing and the sacred responsibilities to nurture those relationships to land-based food and political systems. Settler colonialism has greatly damaged the ability of Indigenous communities to maintain these relationships and feed themselves off the land and using waterways and traditional areas of gathering and access. But communities are working really hard to try to reclaim these kind of traditional food systems and the traditional foods that they need to carry on with language and culture and ceremony. So as a way of trying to understand better how this is playing out across the whole nation. As Joni mentioned, I did a huge road trip. So I started this work in the Mohawk community of Akwesasne on the New York-Canadian border. I spent some time there working with a group called Gastrodiplomacy that was trying to get people back into farming and gardening and planting seeds and eating off of the local land. And so it was a way of trying to understand how other communities were doing this work as well. I took about 4 months and I jumped in the Subaru and drove 20,000 miles around the country and stopped and visited in 40 different communities to talk to people who were part of these community-based farming and gardening projects, and to ask people how they were defining food sovereignty, how were they running these projects, what were some of the challenges and successes. And having these conversations about how people are thinking about food sovereignty, not just as a final destination. I think too often people think and they're like, oh, well, at what point do you become food sovereign? How do we know when we get there, right? Or, oh my gosh, it's too impossible. We just have this little tiny piece of land. We will never achieve food sovereignty. But instead, talking with people about how they're thinking about it as a method, as a tool, as something to work towards. And because I was focused on farming and gardening projects specifically, now granted, the food sovereignty movement is much broader than that. So there are people, especially in the North, that are focused on hunting and fishing and gathering. Here in California, traditionally people did not do a lot of what we would think of as gardening or farming, but were rather tending the landscape in different ways in order to encourage the types of foods that people desire to be happy and at home on this landscape. So I was focused specifically on farming and gardening for this project because that's where my heart was. I love seeds, and I grew up on a little farm doing some gardening. And so because I was focused specifically on farming and gardening projects, seeds played an important role in the movement as people were trying to cultivate it. So the role of seed sovereignty as becoming, on this path to this destination toward food sovereignty. And seed sovereignty basically is the right of farmers and gardeners and community members to save, use, exchange, and protect their own seeds. So protecting them from co-optation, from patenting, from genetic modification, from contamination with cross-fertiling with genetically modified seeds. So seed sovereignty is the right of farmers and gardeners and seed keepers to be able to take care of their own seeds in the ways that they see important and fit. And people saw it as important to plant these seeds and stay connected with these heirloom seeds because of the cultural connections that it provides them to planting, to their ancestors. And so the feeling that every seed that you hold looks and tastes the way it does because of generations of decisions that were made by generations of seed keepers. So every time, your grandma decides at the end of a season which seeds to keep, she's deciding the future color and the height of the plant and the taste of the plant. And so connecting with ancestors in that way was seen as an important reason to want to keep these seeds around. There are different organizations that have formed, community-based organizations, to try to help promote seed sovereignty in Indigenous communities. So the Indigenous Seed Keepers Network is a project within the Native American Food Sovereignty Alliance. And you have wonderful folks like Rowan White, who directs that project. She's a Mohawk seed keeper living in California, who has spent a lot of time working to help communities establish these workshops and networks to help teach people again how to plant specifically for seed saving, how to save seeds, how to network with other communities to have these seed exchanges. The Traditional Native American Farmers Association, Aratisuke Pueblo, has also spent many years helping communities think about how to save seed and plant seed and share seed, and the importance of traditional agriculture. So these are just a few of the organizations that are out there trying to help communities with this work. Some people have seeds that have lived in unbroken, that relationship has been unbroken through eons, through generations. And other communities have had to go looking for some of their seeds, have had to work to try to bring these relatives home through a process we're calling seed rematriation. So many people have probably heard of repatriation, but rematriation really kind of honors those women seed keepers and honors the circular nature of this work. So working to reconnect seeds with people, and in that process, connecting seeds back to the land that they were developed for, and connecting people back to their tribal homelands. And as part of the talk, I gave different examples of some projects where institutions that have held Indigenous seeds for a long time sent some of those seeds home through a process of developing relationships with different Native communities. So everybody from the Science Museum of Minnesota, working with community organizations like Dream of Wild Health and the Upper Midwest Seed Keepers Network to grow out some of the seeds in the collection and send them home to the communities from whence they came. Seed Savers Exchange has been growing out a number of Indigenous varieties and sending them home. The Field Museum is currently working in collaboration with the Meskwaki community in Iowa. There's an organization called Seed Shed that's working with the Hudson Valley Farm Hub and the Mohawk community in upstate New York to develop a native seed garden to make sure that the seed that's grown out can be sent back to the Mohawk community where it belongs. So those are just some examples of work that's being done to reconnect heirloom seeds with the communities from which those seeds were originally collected. So then thinking about, okay, you get people excited about this idea of food sovereignty, growing these heirloom seeds, recollecting with these different heirloom varieties, but then you have to get people to eat it if they're really going to take root in these communities. And so Native chefs have been working hard in organizing and collaborating and forming collectives to support each other to try to get Native people excited about cooking and eating traditional food and instill some of that cultural pride in those foods, and also to help improve health. So to help people want to have a healthier diet through eating some of these traditional foods. And these Native chefs have also been using these foods, in addition to helping their Indigenous communities, to also educate non-Native audiences about Native issues. So this is where the Gastro Diplomacy part of the talk title comes in. And thinking about Gastro Diplomacy as this practice of winning hearts and minds through stomachs. So enhancing cultural understanding and visibility among sometimes an unsuspecting audience. So sometimes people think they're just coming for a neat, novel meal. And as part of it, they get a real education about where those foods are from and some of the important issues that are happening in Indian country. So for example, here in the Bay Area, my dear friends Vincent and Lewis were running up until recently the Cafe Olone, that the goal was to bring people in and teach them about the ongoing presence of Indigenous people in the Bay Area. So they served foods that were all made from pre-contact available ingredients in California, but brought people in as part of, not just teaching them about the foods, but also about their efforts at language revival, some of the history of colonization and missionization in this area. And so as people left, it was like, okay, now you are obligated to go share this information with other people. And so if you hear people spreading untrue information, then we need you to go and correct them because you've learned better now. Another example I gave in the talk is the I Collective, which is a collective of Indigenous chefs from all over the Western Hemisphere that have been hosting meals to bring people together to have some of these difficult conversations about race, about white supremacy, about settler colonial policies, US policies around the border, and Indigenous people who've been trapped and held and mistreated at the border, and around cultural appropriation. So what does it mean for non-Native people to try to take up cooking Native food and passing it off as Native food? And why is that an important issue to be concerned about? In addition, you have people like Sean Sherman and the Sioux Chef crew who have been traveling for several years now around the country and cooking meals from the Indigenous ingredients in those areas as a way of educating people about the fact that there was a cuisine here on Turtle Island prior to the arrival of European cuisines, that there are beautiful foods here that need to be celebrated. In the talk, I also brought up that, okay, so you have people who are working to revive these traditional foods, who are maintaining these traditional foods, all of these things, but they need a clean environment for those foods to be able to thrive. You need clean ground, you need clean soil, you need to keep pipelines off of Indigenous land out of everywhere in order to protect these spaces. Efforts to prevent mines from being established upstream from Indigenous communities and the different food sources. So everybody from the Ponca tribes of Oklahoma and Nebraska that have been working with the Cowboy and Indian Alliance in Bold, Nebraska, planting heirloom corn in the path of the Keystone Pipeline in Nebraska. There are efforts to keep pipelines out of Minnesota, where the concern is around wild rice and making sure that those waters aren't contaminated by oil in order to keep that rice thriving. Efforts to keep mines out of Wisconsin and Minnesota, again, in order to protect wild rice plants from those pollutants that would kill those plants. And then efforts of folks like Brian Yazzie and others who worked in the water protector camps at Ashatishakoi at Standing Rock in order to keep water protectors fed and to make sure they were eating well by eating all of these different Indigenous foods. And Brian has carried that work forward throughout this entire pandemic. He and other Native chefs who are working with him at the Gatherings Cafe, the American Indian Center in Minnesota, have been working to get food out to the Indigenous community there. So carrying on the work that he started there and through his business in order to make sure that the Native community is being fed there. So Indigenous food sovereignty is an international movement. I have just focused on a teeny little piece of the movement, focusing mostly in the US, but I've had the opportunity to visit with Indigenous folks at international corn conferences in Mexico and Belize, and to visit with people there who are similarly working very hard to protect their corn, to promote traditional farming, to make sure that the youth in their communities know about their traditional foods. So international, Indigenous food sovereignty, it's an international movement, and it's still at the core about mending, creating, and restoring relationships. So with that, I will call Melissa back in and see if she has any questions or if there are other questions to be fielded here. Hey.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Liz, for that fabulous overview of your brilliant talk, from garden warriors to gastro diplomacy. Liz and I have had the good fortune of working together both in academia and in community, doing our food sovereignty work, from Native American Studies conferences to ceremony at Akwesasne, to Italy with the slow food movement, really advocating for food sovereignty, as you speak about so eloquently. And your talk really brought out some new language about this work. The whole concept of a garden warrior. Can anyone be a garden warrior? And how is it different from being an ordinary gardener or an ordinary warrior? So you've really put together these two amazing concepts. And I think it's really a reflection of the work in your research, right? It came out of seeing people doing very important activist work through gardening. So if you could speak a little bit more about how that concept came to you of what a garden warrior really embodies.
Yeah, so that term I borrowed from the Dream of Wild Health program, which is in Hugo, Minnesota, north of Minneapolis. And their Garden Warriors program, it's this amazing program where they have young Native folks from the cities that come up. They have summer internships, and so they come up and they spend every day out in the garden, and they learn about gardening, everything from getting the fields ready, getting the seeds in, weeding all summer long, taking care of these plants, harvesting them, learning how to cook them in the kitchens, learning how to take them down to the farmer's market and market them to an audience. So it's this really beautiful, comprehensive program there that also now has a great seed component as well. They have Jessica Greendeer is their seed farmer. And so they're doing some really amazing work to educate the broader community around food. And at the time that I was first visiting there, Diane Wilson was the director. She's now the director of Native American Food Sovereignty Alliance. So we're very excited to have her had moved over to the organization after she had spent a number of years there. And she was describing about how for the youth, the idea of farmer was not that sexy, especially youth of Lakota, Dakota ancestry who saw themselves as descended of hunters and warriors. And so the idea of farming and gardening was really not that sexy.
No.
They came up with the term garden warrior, and the youth thought that sounded a lot cooler. And I think part of that, and if you think about, the morals and ethos that's embodied in that movement and that project there, that it was about, not just putting seeds in the ground and dumping a bunch of chemicals on it. You're not necessarily going to war against those things in the ground and the things that you're working on there, weeds, but thinking, about war against settler colonialism, against the broader things that have oppressed people and made it so that people don't have access to good food, don't have access to their language, to their culture in the same way that they would have. And to be honest, it's not a term that has completely resonated with everyone. So my friend Jim Eno in New Mexico said, Zunis are not keen on slapping the term warrior on everything. You can't just, gardeners and warriors are two very different things. Those are two very different jobs. So you can't just be merging them. So he did not want that title applied to himself after I had interviewed him for the project. So, among the 500 nations in what is now the US, there are different languages, there are different terms, there are different understandings. And so some people think garden warrior sounds, especially if you're somebody who is really devoted to these community projects, to reviving heirloom seeds and fighting against these systems. Some people really like that term for themselves, and others have said, we keep those jobs separate for good reason.
Yeah, wonderful. Well, thank you for that clarification, and always emphasizing the self-determination of each tribal nation and community to determine what kind of, label or role that they adopt. But it is something that I think a lot of people are identifying with right now as we face climate change and, more threats to our global food distribution and more reliance on local resources, that being a garden warrior, I think, has some potency for non-native people as well. And it really relates to another component of your talk of being a water protector. As many of mine, I'm sure your elders have said, water is our first food, and that we cannot grow our food without good water. And so much of your work with The River Is In Us was about ensuring that we can have safe, clean water and cleaning up water that has been contaminated. And I know you were very active at Standing Rock also and advocating for the water protectors movement. So I'd like you to share a bit more about that direct link between water quality and the protection of our water sources and food sovereignty.
Yeah, I mean, I was working, the first book that I was working on in Akwesasne really kind of got its start, got its foundation from conversations that I was having with Gudgie Cook, who is a Mohawk midwife there. And in Akwesasne, they're downstream from 3 different Superfund sites, the most impactful being the General Motors site that is right adjacent to the community that leached PCBs into the river for decades. But it was in the early 80s that people discovered how much PCBs were leaching into the river. And so as a midwife who had been encouraging women to breastfeed, Gudgie was worried about, are the PCBs getting from the water into the fish, from the fish into, women's bodies and into breast milk. And so she's someone, and others who are part of really kind of promoting breastfeeding, who has insisted like food sovereignty should also include breastfeeding, making sure that women have access to mentorship and knowledge around breastfeeding and safe spaces to do so, but also ensuring that that breast milk is safe, that it's not, male people tend to take contaminants into their body and don't have that same outlet. And people who give birth have a way of kind of flushing things, contaminants out of your body through breast milk, through the birth giving process. And so, which is terrible, because who's at the very top of the food chain is infants. And so, this was really the root of the Mother's Milk Project that turned into a big Superfund basic research project that folks at Akwesasne, the Akwesasne Task Force on the Environment, the First Environment Research Project, collaborated with scientists at SUNY Albany to determine the extent of the health impact there. And so at the root of all of this was, how do you get that river cleaned up? How do you prevent the fish from being contaminated? Rather than just telling women, don't eat the fish. Because that was the first public health message was, well, if you don't want PCBs in your breast milk, just don't eat the fish. And that'll be fine. So it's the equivalent of, oh, we'll just slap a fence up around it. We'll just put a cap on it. Just don't touch it and it'll be okay. As opposed to saying, how do we hold mess makers accountable to say, if you dumped it in the ground, you pick it up now. And so that's really been an effort of, movements like all the hard work that the community members did at Akwesasne to try to get that environment cleaned up. And so this generation of water protectors, the people that went and put themselves on the line at Standing Rock, the people who have been working to prevent pipelines in Minnesota and mines in Minnesota and Wisconsin, it's about, how do you keep it from getting there in the first place? So what we've learned is, once you've contaminated a site, once you've contaminated water, it's very hard to clean it up. It's very expensive, and nobody wants to
time consuming.
It's time consuming, it's expensive. And in the process, you're damaging the environment, all of those other communities who are minding their own business, everybody from the critters in the sediment of the river to all of the other plants and animals that were just minding their own business. You impact the health of the people who rely on those spaces for food, but also the language and culture of people as they're being told, oh, just stay out of the river and you won't be affected. And so there's been a movement as well of, okay, how do we hold people responsible to not only have to clean up that mess, but also to take accountability for the damage done to language and culture when people can't interact with the environment in the same way.
Exactly.
That's kind of where the environmental reproductive justice movement also dovetails with the food sovereignty movement.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that. It reminds me that in the West and California and Oregon, so many tribes have been cut off from their primary source of food, their salmon, not necessarily by contaminants with mining or industrial products, but through dams. And the Winnemem-Wintu tribe of Mount Shasta area are actively trying to remove that dam to restore the health of the river and health of their salmon. And these are intergenerational projects, right? Cleaning up a toxic site, it's intergenerational. Cleaning up and restoring a river after a dam has been removed is intergenerational, and yet it's so essential for restoring food sovereignty. So just trying to point.
We had a previous conversation where you talked about ecocultural health. So how the health of people and the rivers and the land are inextricably linked. And so you mess up the land and you mess up the health of the people. And if people are not interacting with the land in a healthy way, that land also suffers. That land misses.
Absolutely. Yes.
So that's important for folks to keep in mind, is that those things are connected. If you cut off the river, then you have severe impacts on all the communities around there.
That's right. That's right. So there's so many intersectional areas where people can have a role in improving food security and food sovereignty for Native peoples. Because folks I talk to often say, I'm not a farmer. I'm not going to become a farmer. It's like, you don't have to become a farmer. You need to be aware of the impacts of, your daily actions on water quality and on soil health and on climate. So everyone can have a role in helping with food sovereignty and security for everyone. Moving on to your wonderful work with Gastrodiplomacy, another fun, fabulous term and I love, changing hearts and minds through the stomach. And you gave some beautiful examples nationally of that work being done. And you've also done work internationally, both in Central and South America and also in Europe with Native chefs. And you've really been such an ethnographer and scholar and advocate for the Native chefs movement. So
somebody has to go sample all the food.
It's a tough job. I know. I've been there with you a couple of times. Or I remember in
our fingers are
in Arizona, one place we were helping deliver food. Yes, and nibbling at all the time. So talk a little bit about this concept of gastrodiplomacy, you've seen it really elevate conversations. You gave the great example from Ohlone Cafe. How about when you don't share a common language and the role of food in that kind of kinship and embodying culture? And it seems that food is the great healer and connector. Have you ever seen a case study where it even resolves conflict? And, you know, even in our tribal nations, we have concepts of sacred food that is used at particular times. So I just want you to share a little bit more about what being a gastro diplomacy person means and how food can help heal between people who maybe have different value systems or different languages.
Hmm. So I first heard this term when I was at one of the Thanksgiving events that the I Collective did, and I was in kind of the back of the house helping with the chopping and sorting. And Britt Reed, who's a Choctaw chef, said that she had spent some time watching Korean television, I think, and that this was a term that she heard. And I was like, oh my goodness, this is really cool. So I started reading and saying, what is this gastro? Because it's one of those words that it seems kind of obvious. And most of the academic literature around gastro diplomacy talks about how, you know, countries will sort of sponsor restaurants in other places. Like if you want more tourism to Thailand, then you help out Thai restaurants in other countries because the Thai restaurants will bring people in who will come to like Thai food and understand Thai food, you know, Thai people differently. And then maybe say, oh, you know, where are we going to go on vacation next year? Maybe we'll go to Thailand. We really like their food. They're really nice there. So it's meant as a way to kind of, you know, change your thoughts and opinions about people from another place. And maybe you want to go there. And the native chefs that I have visited with use it a little bit differently. They're not necessarily trying to get tourism. Nobody's trying to be like, oh, come to our res kind of thing. But it's been more about how do we kind of sneak in these conversations. So you think you're coming for this really fancy, beautiful meal, and you get that. But at the same time, you get a lot of talking that goes along with it, more so than other types of, you know, other types of pop-up meals that I've been to. The chef comes out and says, hi, you know, here's what is the food, and kind of walks off, and that's it, and may tell you something about the conditions in which this chicken lived or whatnot. But for these native chefs, they're coming out and they're saying, okay, here's where these tepary beans come from. Let me tell you about the O'odham people there. Let me tell you about the border wall that's being shoved through their territory right now. And you know how that border is also impacting other people. And then there's borders to the north, and those are also impacting people. So people are looking at this beautiful little tepary bean dish, and all of a sudden they're not just thinking about like, the beans are so earthy and the umami, but it's also like, oh crap, there's also bulldozers and kids in cages and border guards everywhere. So what does that mean to me as the eater who's having a nice time with my little tepary bean dish? So, you know, in talking about the meals that we've been to as part of Slow Food and in Europe, you know, one year Sean Sherman did a meal with a chef named Joel, who was the other kind of Indian. So he was from northern India, and it was just really amazing. You know, they kind of took turns bringing out one course and then the next. And so it was really beautiful to see them kind of bouncing off each other and reminiscing about the foods of their childhoods and how they kind of have taken those and made these other kind of dishes out of them, and how they're using their food in two very different places on the opposite ends of the world, how they're using their food to elevate their tribal communities and try to be like, look, the food of our people, these indigenous people to these very different areas is really beautiful. And I know, you know, Vincent and Lewis were there a different year for a meal in Italy, and talked about the opportunity to present in front of all of these Italians, you know, people who are very serious about food and are very, you know, excited about food and really use food to welcome and bring each other in. And that was great. And prior to this conversation here, you know, Joni and I were visiting, talking about you know, the opportunity I had to visit in Taiwan and some of the indigenous communities there. And I don't speak a word of Chinese, and I've tried, and I'm really bad at it. They didn't speak any English, so we're there with the Google Translate trying to communicate back and forth. But the amazing food, and this is what, you know, they loved that we got so excited about everything that they're bringing out, you know, from the rice that they made there to mountain rats and mushrooms and things that they had harvested, and it was fabulous. And we had grand time.
Wonderful. Wow. That's a great examples. And I know that two other wonderful people in the Native Chef movement, Dr. Lois Ellen Frank and Walter Whitewater, they actually, under the Obama administration, had the title of culinary ambassadors with the US State Department, and traveled to really remote parts of Russia and to Guam and to other areas also. So it's very similar, the idea of culinary ambassadorship. So a beautiful concept. And we're getting some wonderful questions coming in here from our lovely participants. I'd like to share one of them. With young people you have connected with throughout all of your travels, what is their general attitude towards climate change? And are they hopeful to take on the work that's been cut out for them?
Hopeful. Oh, such a time.
Such a time.
Such a time. If you're not hopeful, I don't know how you get out of bed every morning. I don't know that we have an option but to remain hopeful if we're going to stay upright. So, young people are, I can't speak for all the young people, have a wide range of thoughts and opinions. Many are a bit grumpy at the situation they've been handed to inherit this hot mess from generations of people who did not take care, who just dumped everything in the river, polluted everything into the air with impunity. So people are, a little disgruntled at having handled this situation. But, you've got amazing folks like Autumn Peltier who are taking to an international stage, people who are speaking up. You have nations focused on green energy and trying to utilize more solar and wind where it's appropriate. Not everybody wants a solar farm or a wind farm, right? There are traditional food sources. So it's a matter of kind of adopting some of these processes through an indigenous system of priorities. But yeah, and I think, that's part of what led people to really push and resist some of these pipeline projects, fracking projects. My hope is that with a new day, some of those practices have really been overly criminalized. I think everything has been overly criminalized from a abolition perspective in that way. But yeah, I think people have to be hopeful. If you're going to get up every day, you have to be hopeful with a dash of urgency.
Yes, that's right. As Rowan White, our dear colleague, has mentioned, that planting a seed is an act of hope, right? And that's why farming and being a garden warrior, even if it's on a little patio in an urban area, you plant one seed, you nurture that seed, that gives you great hope for the future. And who else? I think David Ora, the environmental educator, said, hope is a plan with your sleeves rolled up. So just get to work, right? But I could imagine, as I talk with so many youth, it is a very trying time to be a young person and having inherited such a crazy mess with environmental contaminants and change. But your work is so inspiring, Liz. So thank you for that. Another question here from the participants. What role can tribal descendants play in these efforts towards food sovereignty? As this person gets older, they want to do more and get even more involved, but worried that it may not be their place. I think it's speaking a little bit to allyship. This person is a very small percentage of Native heritage and was raised in a Native home, but never really felt part of a tribe or a direct descendant, but also wants to get very involved with Native food sovereignty. So what would you say, I guess, a little bit of the mixed blood dilemma of, what is my place being an advocate or supporter for Native food sovereignty?
I think there's a role for allies of all backgrounds as part of this. And so a number of we're organizing a panel right now for a seed conference. And part of what we're bringing up is these partnerships that have developed between communities looking to revive seeds and people who have gardening experience, who have land, who have seeds themselves. Often these different garden projects are looking for volunteers of different kinds, looking for grant writers, looking for, help to find that kind of funding. So I think, approaching a pre-existing project and saying, okay, here's my skill set. What can I offer to you? Can I help you with? That people appreciate that kind of help.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's what I share as well. I mean, come with your, your assets, your skills, and offer those. Web design, audio recording, soil amendments, whatever it may be. There's a way to be a good ally and contribute to native food efforts. And if you come again with a good heart and with some skills and are willing to do what you're asked to do in a good way, you can have a role. You can definitely have a role. There's a lot of work that needs to be done.
There's always weeds to be pulled, right?
Always weeds and watering, weeding and watering alone, right? That's an endless job.
Take bugs off, yeah.
Yeah. So on the question of farming and what people can do to help food sovereignty and the native foods movement, there's always this question about heirloom, organic, versus kind of agribusiness, GMOs. We know that some tribal nations do agribusiness. We know that some farmers, native farmers, are adamantly opposed to using any kind of commercial seeds or hybridized seeds. So what is your position on genetically modified organisms and agribusiness? That's one part of the question. And then the other is the role of tribes and native communities in economics, like economic globalization within agriculture at large.
So it's not my job to tell tribes what they want to do, what should do as far as their economies, as far as their involvement in agribusiness. So some of the people that I've talked to around defining food sovereignty, it's up to that community to decide. We can all have some particular values. And then some people within a tribal community might be like, wow, I wish my tribal government didn't focus so much on commodity crops. Why aren't we focusing more on heirloom varieties? So, with the way the economy currently works, it's easier to make money off growing commodity crops, growing genetically engineered crops, because there's an easy market for those. The equipment is all designed that way. The companies are pushing all of the inputs and chemicals, everything from the nitrogen for the soil up through these seeds. You get trapped in these relationships with companies that are a bit unethical. So some people are saying, okay, we need to step away from that. We need to check out of that market and put energy instead in promoting more heirloom seeds that have not been tampered with, that have not been tinkered with. And the idea around genetically modified, the people have said, well, if these seeds, if we think about them as our living relatives, then who are you to tinker around with them on a genetic level to try to patent them? There's been concerns around agribusiness patenting native seeds. And there has been efforts to try to help communities protect their seeds. Like the Traditional Native American Farmers Association worked with people in New Mexico to try to pass legislation to help communities protect native seeds and to be able to create GMO-free zones so they didn't have to worry about pollen drifting in. And those, the agribusiness has a lot of money and they fight a great deal to make sure people don't have those options. When it comes to patenting, I had the opportunity to visit very briefly with Mr. Ananda Chakrabarty, who was part of the case, the Chakrabarty in 1980, the Supreme Court case that made it legal to patent life because he had developed this bacterium that ate PCBs. I don't know where it's at now. Somebody should put it to work. Yeah. But, so this was the case that sort of opened the floodgates to patenting life, patenting seeds. And, when I caught him before a talk and said, well, how do you feel about how it's applied now? What about all of these indigenous communities that are worried about their seeds being patented, that don't think you should be able to patent another life like this. And his only response was, well, they should patent them first then if they're worried. So he didn't quite get it. People have this very narrow mind frame of this is the only system that we have
Competition and yes, trade.
Yeah, but you know, in many communities, people are not keen on the idea of patenting seeds because who owns the patent? If it took generations, all these different families of developing this particular variety, it's a very Western concept to say, okay, we're going to give that patent to one person. So the community groups that I have been working with are very much focused on planting these heirloom varieties and nurturing those that they have a relationship with. It's hard to develop a relationship with a seed that you are legally bound to treat in a particular way that has been modified on a genetic level. So people are more interested in focusing on those seeds that they can have relationships with, that they can feel good about eating.
That's right. Thank you so much. And I guess a follow-up question from also one of our participants is, do you personally think that eating genetically modified foods is harmful for human health?
I think they don't know yet. They don't, I mean, we know that planting genetically modified seeds has impacted the environment, that all of the inputs, all of the fact that you can just dump a whole ton of Roundup on a crop of corn, and the corn withstands it and is fine, but all of that Roundup, all the glyphosate winds up in the environment, that impacts
the water.
Yes, the atrazine that they've been pouring on corn, that impacts people terribly. I don't think they know enough about what consuming genetically modified food does to human beings. It's been a very short history relative
Very short.
to the lives of humans. I think it'll be a long time. It's very hard to kind of do those kind of studies ethically on.
Yes, it is on human health.
But we're all a great big experiment right now, which is not. I'm not keen. I didn't sign up for this.
No,
I was not given consent.
We were not given consent or consumer information. I mean, still there's a fight against labeling. Yeah. And that's really important. All right, thank you. Another question here. I will speak as if the person. Here in Arizona, in the Gila River, there are examples of large-scale farming practices by the indigenous O'odham people going back many, many centuries. Does scaling look different between different indigenous peoples? Or is it more of a network? I'm not sure about, So I think the question is about the scale of indigenous farming in different regions and different communities.
I mean, I'm not sure if they mean contemporary or historically. I know like Jane Mount Pleasant has done some really interesting work about Haudenosaunee farms in the Northeast, looking at the scale of the types of fields that people maintained and when George Washington sends General Sullivan in to burn up all of the food stores as a way of weakening Haudenosaunee communities, those soldiers documented the millions of bushels of corn that they burned and destroyed, and the acres and acres of cornfields and peach orchards. So, you know, people did scale. And Mount Pleasant's work looks at how people were actually more productive looking at the poundage of food per acre than European farmers using plows and wheat at that same time in history. In contemporary times, I think the projects really vary in scale. So you have the folks at Junhinqua up in Wisconsin, they have great big white cornfields and they've been able to provide a lot of that traditional food for their community. Other people, I think, have had a harder time getting projects that size off the ground. It's hard to get land. It's hard to get access to that much seed, and thinking about, how do you get enough heirloom seed to be able to plant great big huge
large
crops.
Scale.
Yeah, you can't just order it from Agway the same way you can if you're planting 10,000 acres of.
So true. That's right. That's right.
Yeah, so I think the projects tend to be smaller, especially small compared to ancestral field size varieties. But people are working on expanding. I know, like in Akwesasne, people like Tom Cook have been trying to create a farmer co-op and say, okay, if we have these small fields and it's hard to produce enough for any particular buyer or source, how do we collaborate? How do we form these co-ops and pool our resources in that way? So I think that's something that people are thinking about and working on creating a different sense of scale in that way. So taking this private property system that has been thrust on a lot of places, and thinking how to make it more communal again.
Excellent. And I think the question also speaks to the fact that, you can't grow all things in all places, and that the ecosystems and the climate and the soils determine what you grow. And so scale will be determined in large part by that. And some of the work I know you're doing with the Native American Food Sovereignty Alliance, that we've been doing with the Slow Food Turtle Island Association, is really trying to set up these informal and some formal networks of trade, or as Rowan White calls them, kinship networks, so that, we at the Cultural Conservancy grow Oneogen, Seneca white corn from your people in California that was a gift to us from the Bray family from the upper New York, your territories. Likewise, folks are always trading seeds and foods and sending bison and dried salmon and Hawaiian salt to each other. So what role do you think restoring these traditional trade networks has for Native peoples on Turtle Island, and the work you've been doing with NAFSA and others in this area?
Yeah, I mean, Dan Cornelius with the Intertribal Ag Council has been talking for years about reconnecting the trade routes. And, for several years, he had his van and he was driving all around, picking up one food here and dropping it off here and picking things up and setting up little markets as a way of trying to get people to think about, if you're, what does food sovereignty mean? It doesn't necessarily mean that everything you eat has to be produced in your own front yard, because people have always traded. You find copper in some areres and macaw feathers that have traveled
That's right. Thousands of miles.
Chocolate. I mean,
Chocolate.
be without chocolate.
Yes. And vanilla.
But there's a difference between like, oh, I'm just going to eat this chocolate produced by children slaves in Africa, or you go visit with Julio Saki in with Che Mayan chocolates, and I know he has an amazing plantation there that is shade grown, that it's run by Mayan people, that it's a terrible word, plantation, but
yeah,
a batch of trees. It's a nice batch of all different kinds of cacao trees, that pods of all different colors, that they're then harvesting and producing the chocolate right there. And so, reconnecting those trade routes, getting your chocolate from Julio, and feeling good about eating it then, and then getting wild rice out of the Midwest instead of the patty rice
in
California that's called
yes.
rice. It's not. It's just a co-optation and a corruption.
That's right.
You can see where all my little pet peeves are. But
yes,
reconnecting those trade routes, trading your corn for canned salmon and other associated treasures.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you. It seems that there's quite a few in-depth questions here. I'll get to a couple of others from our great audience. Some efforts to improve seed sovereignty are embracing strategies such as using grassroots developed open source, formal licensing and certifications in an effort to have a stronger legal defense against privatization of seed commons while meeting these privatization commercialization threats on their own terms. Do such ideas resonate in the nations that you've been working with, or is the idea of any form of licensing not welcome?
I'm not sure, to be quite honest. So this sounds a bit like what Jack Kloppenberg and folks have been on out of University of Wisconsin. And I know I sat in on a panel real briefly a few years ago at a summit that was there. But I'll be quite honest, I'm not sure. I personally haven't heard those conversations happening, but that doesn't mean that they're not. People have plenty of conversations that I'm not privy to. But I can't necessarily speak to that.
Yeah.
It sounds like an interesting idea.
It's a great question. Yeah, I can't really speak to that one either, but thank you for that great question. I also wanted to just get back to the idea of indigenous cuisine or native cuisine. And I think, sadly, this is a relatively new concept, right? Even when I still, and I'm sure you too, with non native audiences in academia or museums or certain areas talk about native cuisine. I mean, it's really been what, the last 10 years, 20 years? Why do you think it's taken so long for the idea of Native American cuisine to really like hit the popular consciousness in America and around the globe? And are there any partners or initiatives that have helped to kind of elevate the idea of indigenous cuisine or native cuisine?
So why has it taken so long? I think in order for settler colonialism to have worked, settlers had to dehumanize the people who lived here to such an extent that they were completely unworthy of this land and this space. And part of that was this whole notion of, well, you're not even using the land properly. You're just eking out a living. And this has
Mhm.
been the understanding that people had was pre-contact Native folks were just eking out a living, living in just little bark houses or holes and just eating roots dug out of the ground or maybe a little bit of corn or a little bit of meat boiled there with
Mhm.
it. So the notion was everything, or even the romantic. So that's sort of like the extra racist white supremacist view, or the romantic notion of indigenous people, that everything was just so like beautiful and simple,
Harmonious and
harmonious,
simple.
simple, but it's
Mhm.
still like you're just nibbling roots here,
Mhm.
or eating every single inch of the buffalo, so you're just nibbling on the hoof over here, really
Mhm.
like not leaving any impact on the environment. So I think either ends of those spectrum of stereotypes have led people to just think that only Europeans and maybe the Japanese came up with a beautiful cuisine. That's the money. That's the food we're willing to spend lots of
Mhm.
money on, right? And Christian Nandu Ray out of NYU has written a lot about ethnic restaurateurs and what kind of food are people do people consider elevated enough to spend a lot of money on? So we want very cheap Mexican food, but we'll pay a lot of money for French food.
Mhm.
And so I think people there, it just wasn't on the radar. Like, oh, Native people didn't have a cuisine; they were just gnawing on, a squash here and
Rawhide.
yes,
Yeah, right.
breaking it down with a really good tea.
Uh-huh.
And so I think it's really taken work like Loretta Barrett Oden, who I think was
Mhm.
the people at the Food Summit always refer to her as the OG of the chefs.
She is. She's
Started Corn Dance Cafe in Santa Fe and brought to people's attention all of these beautiful foods. And then you've got, the Native American Culinary Association that Nephi Craig worked on to support other Native chefs. And you've got Sean Sherman and the sous chef operation that really, I think, started to get a lot of the media attention, that people started picking up on the foods that he was making. And part of it is that, he plates them in these really beautiful artistic ways. He talks about at one point he wanted to be an art student. And so that art really
Mhm.
comes out in his food. And so then
Mhm.
people are looking at it very differently, like, oh, that doesn't look like a raw cup of corn that you're knobbing.
Yes.
It's beautiful, it's colorful. It's just,
Aesthetic.
yes, it's just as
Mhm.
beautiful as the plates you're getting at a French restaurant. So maybe we'll pay attention to this. So I think that's partly what it has taken, the media in a different way.
Mhm.
And you mentioned Lois and Walter and the work that they've been doing for years, and Lois and the beautiful photography work that she's done
Exactly.
around food.
Mhm.
It took making it look really beautiful and elegant and elevated for people, I think, to pay more attention to it.
Yeah, to take it seriously. Yeah, I remember first hearing from John Mohawk about using the Iroquois white corn at the White Dog Cafe in Philadelphia and in New York City, and really elevating that in the late 80s and early 90s. And I think he was such a great leader also in putting, native foods on the map, not just as, like you said, this kind of primitive eke out a living scenario, but actually as a really fine cuisine of taste with salt and sweet and and salty and, dried, and all of those different elements that create what we think of as traditional cuisine. So it's been a big effort. It's a little sad it's taken so long, but I'm very happy it's here to stay. And I'm very happy that your work has been elevating Native chefs and their work in such a significant way. And do you think that the slow food movement has had a positive impact on that? And you and I and many others have been interacting with the slow food movement nationally and internationally for quite some time now. And I and others are interested in hearing a little bit more about your perception and understanding of the role of the slow food movement in supporting food sovereignty and some of the positive aspects of that, maybe some of the more challenging ones.
Yeah, I think some of the challenges are, so as you mentioned, Slow Food Turtle Island, and we formed that as a group, and it was really folks like Winona LaDuca and Loretta and Akape and some of these other folks who early on said, okay, there needs to be a slow food group that's specifically comprised of Indigenous people, so independent of these settler colonial borders. The first year that I went to Terra Madre in Italy as a Slow Food USA person, because we didn't have separate representation. So we went with Slow Food USA, and we really wanted to spend more time visiting with like the Slow Food Canada Indigenous folks, and they were, sent off to their quarters, and and so it was like, oh, we're also separated because of, which
nation state.
Yes.
Which colonial power.
Colonial power is, running your
imprinted you.
So the idea was how to develop a group that can represent, and looking at the Arc of Taste, which is a platform that's meant to draw attention to foods and processes of making foods that are seen as kind of in danger or that people need to know more about. And many of the foods that are on the Arc of Taste are Indigenous varieties that were put there by non-Native folks, often kind of working as allies, as they saw, to try to elevate and draw attention to these foods. So people were like, well, who put these there? Why isn't the story right that go with these? Why isn't the example right? So the idea was to develop a separate slow food category for Indigenous people. The challenge has been that we don't have any funding, so we don't have any staff, so it's all volunteers. And the people who step up and say, oh, yes, I will help and work on this are the ones that have 85 other commitments on the daily, who are working very hard in their own home communities, working on different food projects. And so that then makes it hard to find the time to do the kind of organizing on a bigger level. So if anybody wants to give us a whole bunch of money, we will just get that going in a minute. I tell you, we'll just
exactly
amazing staff. So people have partnered with different slow food chapters where closer to their homelands to work on different projects. They've sent chefs like Sean and like Vincent Lewis and other Native chefs. Tried to help provide support and provide a platform so people are aware of those efforts, of those culinary projects that are happening.
Exactly. And again, getting back to your gastrodiplomacy, I've also been involved with Indigenous Terra Madre is part of the global Indigenous Food Sovereignty movement, and it's a formal network within Slow Food International and kind of parallel. And that part of the inspiration for what we've been trying to do with Slow Food Turtle Island Association here in Turtle Island, US, Canada, and Mexico, and a little bit Hawaii and Alaska. And there's a little more support for that. And I've seen many of us come from around the world and do not speak a common language. But the minute we pull out our seeds and pull out our salt and pull out our dried this and that, there's so much incredible cultural exchange and revitalization and kinship that is shared through the taste and stories of our food and the songs of our food, even when we don't speak the same language. So that's quite powerful. Excellent. I think there's a couple of other wonderful questions coming in. Natural resource managers are just beginning to recognize and value traditional ecological knowledge. And they're asking for this valuable knowledge and expect to often pay nothing for it. what is being done to employ enrolled tribal members in positions of power and research positions? Great question.
Yeah, they should read Melissa's new book.
Thank you. And your many books. Yeah.
But this idea of, yeah, I mean, I think it's been an issue, the expectation of that people of all ages will just volunteer this knowledge, so that the elders in your community who have spent their entire lives working on this education, on this research that is the interactions that lead to a real in-depth understanding of how the environment works. And like, oh, well, we'll just send people in to interview them, and then we'll just glean this, and we'll just pick out the useful bits. So I know that some tribes are developing their own environment divisions and hiring people in that way. Here, I'm in the Environmental Science Policy Management Department here at UC Berkeley, and I'm excited. I just got here, but part of what really drew me to this job was knowing that I would be able to work with Native grad students who are then working to apply this education, this knowledge to projects in their own home communities. So we have a handful of Native grad students here in this department already, and others who have been reaching out to me that want to come and get their degree so that they can then go home and work on projects in their communities. So I'm hoping that going forward, that there'll be more of that understanding. So that's, people getting official degrees and then going back to get jobs. But also, for some of these grant projects, it should be necessary that these elders are paid as experts in the same way that if you brought on a university official or another kind of consultant, that you would have to pay them. You wouldn't expect, Joe with a master's degree over in the resources office to just volunteer
and give all this expertise and interviews and knowledge and tools for nothing. That's right. Yeah. I think of two wonderful Native California Indian scholar activists who went through degree programs. Frank Lake, Yura Karuk, who is they're both fire ecologists and fire specialists, and Don Hankins, who is Miwok at Chico State University. And they've really applied their work. They get consulted by the U.S. Forest Service, national parks, Bureau of Land Management. But it did take going and getting their graduate degrees. So for all you students out there, yeah, it's good. Yeah, get your degrees in the School of Sustainability at ESPM at Berkeley, wherever you are. And it really does make a difference. And there's a whole new generation. Since I've been doing this work, 30 years now, I see so many young people, and Liz, I'm sure you have too. It's a very exciting time that we've elevated Indigenous sciences and traditional ecological knowledges and food sovereignty in a way that are really finally getting some of the recognition they deserve. It's still an uphill battle. I think we still all have a lot of work to do. But thank you for that excellent question. One more person really wanted to hear a little bit more about the water protectors work you've done and the link between water protection and food sovereignty. Specifically, could you talk a bit more about how water protectors engage with and evaluate technological solutions for cleaning up water? They mentioned water recycling. I would also mention like bioremediation or, ecotoxicology and some of the more technological fixes to water restoration. And if you can speak a bit about that.
This is way out of my area of expertise, but a fascinating idea. I mean, I think so much more should be done with gray water and water recycling. One of the places I visited was with Lillian Hill at the Hopi Tetsuo Culture Project. And I was so impressed because the gray water from her home, from her kitchen sink, from, her shower, is filtered out through the yard and supports like this happy batch of plants there in Arizona where it's quite dry. So rather than just throwing away all that water, she's supporting these plants in her front yard. And so I think of like how many other places should be doing that. Everybody should be doing that. So yeah, so I am not an expert in any of these technologies, but I would certainly love, now that I've moved from a place where there was so much water, California does not have as much water, so kind of trying to rethink water usage here.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I know there's been some really exciting research done by some Native researchers in, ecotoxicology and also in more technological fixes, bioremediation, and using native plants like tule and cattail that usurp certain toxins and then break them down, and then you have to process the plants. You kind of sacrifice some plants in the process, and fungus. There's been a lot of mycoremediation being done with fungal mats and mycocelia and mushrooms, so that's another area. So as my elders always say, I'm sure yours too, Liz, we'll take the best technology if it helps us. One auntie says, I can still grind my acorns in a blender. It doesn't make me less traditional, right? I like blenders sometimes. So certainly some of those technological fixes, if they don't inadvertently add another pollutant to the water source, I think it's really, we need all the help we can get to clean up our water. So thank you for that question about water. We're running close on time here, and I think I want to talk a little bit more about your seed rematriation work with the Native American Food Sovereignty Alliance and Rowan White, and that's one of the last questions here. You've spoken quite a bit about the important role of plants and seeds from one generation to the other, as we say, warm hand to warm hand, from elder and youth and families going through the generations. How do you personally, how do the stories surrounding seeds and their cultures impact you and your work? I guess a little bit more the cultural significance of seed rematriation and passing seeds on intergenerationally.
Yeah, there's been so many of these projects have had these really neat stories that go with them. Deb Echohawk, I highly encourage all of you to look her up. She's a Pawnee seed keeper who's been working with relatives in Oklahoma to find and bring home seeds. And they had seeds that, she helped track down in people's cupboards up through bundles that were returned from a historical society and bringing to life the seeds that were stored in there. And people have been very excited to welcome these seeds home. So the project that we're working on with the Field Museum, I'm part of an advisory committee there to revamp an exhibit hall, and I agreed to that because I knew there were seeds in the collection.
Mm-hmm.
So I got there and was like, okay, now where's the seeds? And they're like,
yeah, right.
lady, this is not a seed bank. This is not how any of this works.
Yes.
The museum, but then, they said, well, I got to see the lists, and I saw that in the anthropology collections, because it's very interesting, thinking about, in a museum, and especially a natural history museum like the Field, you have seeds that are in economic botany up there, where it's, just all these different plant seeds from all over the world. And then there's seeds in anthropology, because in a sense, they are a product of human interaction, these different domesticated crop varieties. And so there was a list from Tama, Iowa, where the Meskwaki settlement is.
Mm-hmm.
And it turned out the crazy story that went with these seeds is that in the early 1900s, William Jones was the first Native guy to become an anthropologist. He was raised in the Sac and Fox community in Oklahoma. So he gets his PhD in anthropology, and he's working in different communities, and he's sent to Meskwaki, who are culturally similar to the people he grew up with, to try to collect all these things, because the notion was like all these people are just going to disappear anyway. This is the era of salvage ethnography. So they sent him to collect all these things. So he collects, clothing and mats and spoons and bowls and all of these, artifacts and seeds. And he writes on little slips of paper in the Meskwaki language, little strips from the legal pad with pencil, and tucks it in each bag of seeds. And the stuff is sent off to the Field Museum. And then for his next job, they send him off to the Philippines to collect among the Ilongot headhunters. And it's, the story's a little shifty about exactly what
Oh,
happened, but they stab him to death.
oh,
He dies. And so then his collection just sort of gets
oh.
sent here and sent there. And it sits on the shelf in the Field Museum for like 100 years until
Wow.
we come nosing along and be like,
Yes.
so what do we got here? Um, and so then as part of this project, we invited some people from Meskwaki, from the Meskwaki Food Sovereignty Initiative, up to visit with the seeds. And these elders taking the little notes out and reading them. They're like, oh, this one means that this bean is called like afraid to be away from the house or something like that. It tells you how it wants to be grown.
Oh,
So that was amazing. And then the
wow.
conversation turned to, okay, how do we send some of these seeds home to go back in the ground? Maybe they'll sprout. These beans are 100 years old. Generally, seeds don't want to loiter that long before sprouting again. But it was like, hey, let's give it a try. And to the credit of the museum, which has all of a sudden started being like, okay, let's give it a try. There was a destructive analysis form filled out because to deaccession something from museum collections takes a very long time. And some of those seeds went back and they didn't sprout the first year, but it
Mhm.
started this whole series of conversations and a very different relationship than the Field Museum had previously had with the community. So people drove the seeds down. There was a feast. They were like, hey, you came down to our museum. Usually we have to go up there and knock on your door and ask for our things back. And so here, a more reciprocal relationship has come to be developed. And so now part of the new exhibit in the North American Hall will be about Meskwaki food sovereignty. And
Wonderful.
maybe some seeds will sprout by then. COVID sort of messed up all our plans for this spring.
Mhm.
We've been talking, and as part of a different project, interviewing plant scientists about how would you wake up seeds this old, and what is the community okay with? Which processes are they okay with being applied to their seeds? So we'll try again.
To
Hopefully
wake them
by
up.
this spring, things will be back to less chaotic than the world is right now. Who the heck knows? But in the
Yes.
meantime, those seeds kind of worked their own magic, even if they don't sprout and make it back into people's gardens. Um, so I've seen other instances where seeds did get to find their way home, like at the Southwest Food Summit, where Rowan
Mhm.
brought squash back from the Seed Savers Exchange that had been away from Taos for like 70 years. And they sprouted those seeds, and she brought that squash. And the women cradled it like a baby. It was like bringing home somebody who had gone missing from the community for a long time. And it was really beautiful. So it's,
Mm.
this desire to keep reconnecting people to each other and people to these seeds that kind of keeps the momentum of this going.
Beautiful. Thank you. What a great image and a great story. I love that. And I think you had some photographs of that in your great slideshow. Yeah.
Mhm.
Thank you. And folks have just been so grateful for your work, Liz. And, your work has implications for Indigenous peoples locally, regionally, nationally, and internationally. And you've done some international travel. I know we've done some of it together. And one person wants to find out if your work has been translated into different languages yet, maybe not yet, okay. And also, what do you see in your future in terms of your work moving more into a global arena with a global Indigenous food movement? Or do you see really zeroing in a little bit more locally or regionally with some of your food research?
It's a good question. So I'm trying to finish a book right now that is, it covers a lot of the topics that we're going to talk. I'm also working with Sean Sherman. We're pitching a cookbook similar to the one that he already did, but that will cover more regions. So that's something that we're working on. The chapter that I wrote about native chefs for this book that I'm working on right here turned out to be 50,000 words instead of 14,000 words, which is much too long for a chapter. So I'm
Yes,
yes,
it is.
say, hey, can I turn that into its own book? Um, and then after that, I mean, Rowan and I have been talking about writing a book about different seed keepers, bringing out some of these stories of people that have worked so hard as part of the seed rematriation movement. So maybe this winter we'll get to, now that I'm in California, we'll get to sit down and visit around that book. I've been approached by a tribal community that looked to Akwesasne as an example of creating community-based projects using some funds from a polluting industry to help create programs to revitalize language and culture. So they want me to do a project bringing together, seeing what other tribes have done that. And then also I'm working with the Native Conservancy out of Alaska.
Dune Lankard's work.
Yes, Dune roped me into this.
The great Dune and Winona. Yes.
Yes. So figuring out, communities that were impacted by the Exxon Valdez oil spill that are trying to rebuild their tribal food systems and economies, and thinking about, ways of doing that through kelp and other projects. So there's that. And I wrote a paper a little bit ago on kind of the metaphors around fire and social movements and Indigenous uses of fire. And now I am in the land of Indigenous people who really think a lot about fire in a very different way than other places that I have lived. So I'm interested to learn more about Native firefighters and Native of fire. And that relates to the food sovereignty projects as well. I mean, people in California used fire quite a bit as a way of, grooming the environment for desired food crops. And so.
Exactly. It's attending and mending tool. Yeah. Excellent.
A lot to do. So as far as the international stuff, I mean, I've had some really fabulous trips to New Zealand and have gotten to visit with some of the Maori food projects there. Our colleague Maria Elena Wambachano, working for a while in comparative Peru, New Zealand food sovereignty stuff. So, I love going over there, eating their food. I'd love to give up to Samiland.
Kai. We'll get up to Samiland. I was there last February with the reindeer folks. It was great. Well, thank you, Liz. Just on behalf of, being a colleague and sister, just thank you so much. And I'm going to pass it over to the wonderful Dr. Joni Adamson to close us out today. But a pleasure being in conversation with you. Miigwech.
This has been so rich and wonderful. I hate to shut it down, but we are at time. I hope that we'll be able to bring you out again. Last year at this time, some of the members of the research group and I were down in Tucson meeting the mother of corn, Teosinte, for the first time, in the form of seed. So it would have been nice if we could have done something like that, got out into a field. We have some of our community gardeners here in the audience. That would have been lovely. But please, everybody give Liz a virtual thank you and a virtual, applause. So we're all applauding you. And please, everyone, take care to look at our upcoming events. We have a wonderful event in February that is going to be the Religion and Ecology Relations and Relationality Conference. We're bringing in a wonderful speaker. She's going to be our 2021 distinguished speaker. Her name is Tiffany King, and she wrote a wonderful book called Black Shoals, Offshore Formations of Black and Native Studies. So this has been a wonderful event. Thank you so much, Elizabeth Hoover. Thank you so much, Melissa Nelson. And thanks to everyone who has just so wonderfully come together to make this wonderful event. And we'll look forward to having you back, Liz. Thanks, everyone. Bye.